Hello, YouTubers and whoever else. So I wanted to make a talk about an issue that I've been struggling with recently, and it's concerning forgiveness, I suppose. I find myself dwelling too much on so many issues over so many years, in fact, some going back as far as 25 years ago, and issues going back. Spanning all across that time, things from just a few years and months ago. I think there are particular episodes that I obsess about sometimes. And it's a really a lot. It seems when it's about petty, silly things like a swear word or a simple put down, it's relatively minor and it's forgotten about. There's a whole conveyor belt of those, I think, actually. But when it's actually something that's serious, that's substantial, that's sustained over a long period of time, and that has had a real detrimental effect on you physically or mentally, and it's really had a severe impact on the quality and the type of life. And it's something that you think about on a weekly, monthly, on a yearly basis, and affects the entire life, in fact, then it is much more of a struggle. And I think we all are probably given out various struggles like that and issues that are deeply affecting. And I suppose on my own personal one, I'm not going to go into detail now on the nature of it. But suffice to say that it's something that has affected me on a very deep level, something that has affected my ability to have relations with others, and my own value of myself, my own self-worth. Something that affected me for many, many years, a really bad relationship full of lots of psychological abuse, with a whole multitude of things within that. But actually, for many years subsequently after that, I chose not to dwell on it. I chose not to think about it. Who would want to? I just wanted to move on with relationships, jobs, houses, holidays, as you do in life. But actually, I found that didn't work. That if I was not looking at it, if I was trying to pretend that it didn't happen, that I didn't actually resolve the issues. I didn't actually take the time to constructively look and think of how it affected me. And it did actually, because at a very young age, when something goes on for many years and it affects you quite deeply and personally, when it's surrounding you on a day-to-day basis for many years, that affects how you deal with the world and your ability to have various relationships. I mean, how I would describe it is much like a psychiatrist told me last year in a book of his that I read. And he described it that as we're developing on our life journey, we design these various maps, these cognitive maps that we draw inside our heads. And those maps basically define how we view the world based on all of our collective experiences up to that time, our individual experiences, sorry. So if our experiences are severely limited and we see and we only know someone as abusive, we will then tend to think the whole world is abusive until we have seen other people, and then when we've met more people, we redraw those maps and we change them. But the psychiatrist basically was saying to me that sometimes we are so used to carrying around these old maps that we've carried for so many, many years, that actually we find it difficult to erase and redraw parts of the map and change how we've been thinking. If we've had this mistrust and this sort of this anxiety and this paranoia and suspicion about other people, and this separation from them, as a result of many, many years, it's then quite hard to suddenly and dramatically change. It may be that a gradual shift is something that we can do. And actually how we feel about what's happened to us in the past is something that you can change gradually as well. And you'll feel very differently according to the mood, your temperament, and according to the work you've done, the effort you've made over many years. I suppose there are many different ways of doing that, but trying to sort of see the other person's viewpoint, trying to humanize them almost, and see why they did it. Trying to see the good in them as well, actually, rather than this pantomime demonized figure, not covering over or glossing over the bad that may have been done, but also seeing it in its wider context as well. Not just seeing them as this sort of demonized pantomime character, but also seeing the good and the bad within them. But also seeing, had they suffered, had they been through other things, investigating it, from a wider angle, and seeing them as a more complex and more rounded person. So that sort of helps, I suppose, talking to other people that have been through similar experiences, especially that are maybe later stages on the journey, and what's helped for them. There's various other sort of counselling and things, various therapy groups, and for me, I think reading the stories of various survivors and people that have come through things and their own accounts and various other documentaries, that's helped aid me a lot as well. But trying to sort of, I suppose, see the person not as a monster, but see them as a person who probably was a victim and vulnerable themselves, and trying to sort of like confront them in a compassionate way, in a way that's more understanding, that's more realistic of their overall human nature. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to somehow sort of confess, or they'll say, yes, I am so sorry I did any of these things. They may live in denial, and that can happen, of course. But I think for me, what's important is not letting the anger and not letting the depression alone define you. I think what's really crucial is still finding that other kind of joy in life, and actually realizing that you survived and you endured and you got through something. And actually to have gotten through something is an achievement in itself. And to have not allowed it to have affected you and to alone defined you, and to have not done awful things that could have been done to you in the world, and to have not responded tit for tat, I suppose, there is some sort of success in that. But I think as well, recognizing as well where it may have also had some negative impacts on your life, and recognizing, where your ability to change those things for, and to making an effort, to striving to improve yourself. There are many other goals that are important to recognise and achieve. But the purpose of my video, really, to come on to the main core of it, is really to look at it from a more strategic viewpoint. Just because we tend to be really driven by emotions, and how you feel about really serious issues like abuse, or it could be someone that's really harmed you or a member of your family, in a serious way, whether it's financially, physically, psychologically, socially, emotionally, sexually, even in whatever way it is. We're often driven by those emotions. We often feel like an anger towards it, or we can feel as well a really terrible depression. We can feel really sad and torn up inside, like a broken-hearted. We can feel really confused sometimes and muddled and sort of uncertain, am I to blame somehow? Or why did that happen? Or why did they do that? Or why didn't other people step in to help? Or why hasn't it been recognised more widely since? You could be asking a whole multitude of questions, perhaps sometimes without even answers. You go around wondering. And so we are often driven by these different emotions, or even doubt. That's a big one too, isn't it? Was what happened that bad? Did it really affect me? Am I a legitimate victim? Do I have the rights to be honest about it? Or how and when and why should I talk about it? There's a whole range of different issues. But the emotions that we have about it, and of course the other one I haven't mentioned, the other big emotion is fear, isn't it? Of course, what will the other people think? What will my community think? What will the alleged perpetrator think? And their family, what will they think? What will people I know think about it? That there can be senses of shame about it as well in talking about some issues, especially. So there are these whole range of different spectrum of different kind of emotions that you're working through, from doubt to fear, anger, depression and sadness, to confusion. Even sometimes, you might feel a sense of satisfaction and joy, in fact, that you've actually gone through that, you've escaped that, or that period in your life has ended. even if you may still have flashbacks, or even if you may be jaded or not having the best relationships with people, or you may not be fully on the road to recovery as where you'd want to be, but still there's that kind of satisfaction that one chapter at least where bad things happened is over. But there's this whole range, this whole spectrum of different emotions, really. And sometimes, like if you're wading through the depression, that's sometimes, if you're not dealing with the issue that I wasn't for a long time, and you're sort of numbing yourself with drink or drugs that I did for many years, and distracting yourself with other people's issues or other things that are trivial, or keeping busy all the time, busy, work, holidays, parties, everything else. And years later, you realise you haven't made any effort, you haven't worked through any issues, and it's all been filed away in all these drawers, and it all comes tumbling out on top of you, is what happened to me, I suppose. And at that point, depression can really hit you because you haven't made any effort, you don't have any coping strategies built up for how to deal with that. And after weeks and months wading through that without, perhaps a support network or those coping strategies, you can really sometimes be driven by that sadness, that prolonged sadness, where you just look back, and that can lead to pitying yourself and self-sympathy almost, and, victimizing yourself too much almost, not recognizing where you've actually come through things and where you've actually overcome some things at least. Equally, we can be driven by anger sometimes, and by blind hatreds. And so I think that if we're driven by any one emotion, unregulated, unrestrained too much, that can be too bad. Those emotions do have a place in check. But if they're regulated properly, it's when it's unbridled, it's when it gets out of hand, when it becomes an obsession, when it becomes so disorderly that it becomes pathological, that's when it's a problem. So having the emotions and going through them is normal and is right for everyone. But it's when those emotions become excessive, overwhelming and debilitating, that's when it becomes too much of a burden. And so actually what I came to a position of recently is finding a way of looking at it more constructively by removing the emotion from it. And that's by employing a logical, deductive analysis of it. And actually, there's this theory called game theory. And basically, with game theory, it involves several participants. It's kind of like a game, but not a game in the traditional sense of the word. It's a game in a sense that there are various participants, there are rules within it, and that the various people have got the option within it, either of competing against each other or cooperating with one another. And what happens within the game, and there are various forms of it, but what happens loosely is that the various people have different options of how they react to the different participants. And according to what those different reactions are, there are different results, different outcomes that can be achieved through that. Probably the most famous, the most notorious version of the game theory is the prisoner's dilemma that many people have heard of. And that's when, say for example, the police will capture two suspects and they will make them a deal. They keep the suspects separate, of course, in separate cells. And they say to suspect A, if you confess to the crime and implicate B, then you'll get a much lesser sentence. And they'll go back to B and say the reverse. If you implicate A and you admit to the crimes, you'll get a lesser sentence. If both A and B deny any involvement, they both go free because there's no other evidence in this case. However, if they both implicate each other, then they'll both get sent to prison on that occasion. But if only one of them implicates the other, but the other one doesn't, then it's the one who's implicating. So that's one scenario, but there's a whole spectrum of variants that there could be according to that. So you can change the kind of the various the participants' options according to the specific dilemma that they're in. So it's endlessly possible to sort of change those options. I'll show you one possible one that's actually